weren't running toward a better life. We were just running. When you're 23, with nothing in your pockets but crumpled 20s, past due student loans, and a couple of battered suitcases, you don't get to be choosy. You just look for a roof, any roof, as long as it doesn't leak and the rent doesn't squeeze the last drop of blood out of you. Caspian Lake, Vermont, a god-forsaken town on the northernmost edge of the state, right up against the Canadian border. Out here, it smells like wet pine needles, damp stone, and a very specific kind of small-town rot all year round. The old granite quarry closed down a lifetime ago, and the town was slowly, but grudgingly dying, swallowed by the encroaching timber. I managed to land a job at the local lumber yard, lugging heavy, ice-cold, waterlogged boards for 12 hours a day. Jenny tried her best to find some remote graphic design gigs, but the Wi-Fi in this valley worked every other day, and the clients just weren't there. Our savings were evaporating so fast, it made my stomach churn every time I risked opening my banking app. That's why Mrs. Vane's listing felt like a miracle. She was renting out the second floor of an old, weathered wooden duplex at the very end of Mill Road, right where the asphalt crumbled into a solid wall of ancient forest. $600 a month flat, plus another $66 for water and the heating oil. $666, all in. I remember chuckling about it that morning, making some stupid throwaway joke to Jenny about paying our dues to the number of the beast just to keep a roof over our heads. God, what a blind, arrogant idiot I was. The house itself looked grim, of course. Peeling gray paint, rotting steps on the outdoor wooden staircase that led straight up to our door, and windows that stayed perpetually fogged and greasy. Mrs. Vane met us on the porch, a heavy, bloated woman in a faded, oversized cardigan who seemed to consist entirely of a wheezing cough and quiet resentment. She reeked of menthol cough drops and stale, damp textiles. When I asked about the previous tenants, she answered reluctantly, her tiny, fat-rimmed eyes darting everywhere but at me. She just muttered that the last guy, some single fellow, had left in a hurry, almost in the middle of the night, but had kept the place in perfect order and paid a month in advance. We didn't dig into his reasons. We were just glad to have a place. We moved our meager belongings in and stacked the boxes. Inside, the apartment was claustrophobic. Just a narrow one-bedroom setup with dusty, heavy furniture, creaking floorboards covered in worn linoleum in the kitchen, and old cabinets that smelled of stale linseed oil. But the main thing was the isolation. Our own roof, our own corner where we could finally breathe after months of drifting. The first warning shot fired that very evening, just as we finished carrying up the last of the boxes. And it had everything to do with our cat, Barnes. Jenny had picked up this 3-colored calico on the shoulder of a highway when she was just a kitten. Barnes had always been an exceptionally lazy, peaceful, and affectionate creature. She never scratched, never hissed, and loved nothing more than curling up on Jenny's lap, purring like a tiny engine. But the moment I stepped over the threshold of our new apartment, carrying her plastic crate, the animal completely snapped. A deep, guttural growl vibrated inside the plastic box, a sound I had never heard her make in her life. When I unlatched the door, Barnes didn't just walk out. She practically exploded into the room. Her fur was standing on end, her tail puffed up like a bottle brush, and her pupils were so dilated her eyes looked pitch black. She let out a wild, feral hiss, staring not at us, but past us, straight into the shadows of the empty hallway. Jenny gasped, reaching out a hand, but Barnes lunged into the living room with a frantic yowl and wedged herself deep under the heavy, massive sofa in the corner. She squeezed herself all the way back against the baseboard, emitting nothing but a low, panicked, rhythmic spitting. No matter how much Jenny called her, no matter how much she shook the bag of her favorite treats, the cat refused to budge. When I aimed my phone's flashlight under there, all I saw were 2 glowing green embers in the absolute dark. The poor thing was shivering violently. In the end, we decided to leave her alone, chalking it up to the long drive and the stress of a new environment. She'll calm down by morning, I thought. Christ, I was an idiot. I remember sitting in the cramped kitchen, deep into the night. It was around 2 a.m. On the table sat an empty tin can of Bush's baked beans that I'd rigged into a makeshift ashtray. I was smoking cheap, hand-rolled drum tobacco, drawing in the bitter smoke and staring out the window at the black tops of the pines swaying in the wind. The house was wrapped in a suffocating, heavy silence. Only once in a while, from downstairs, through the thin floorboards and the cheap insulation, came the dry, hacking cough of Mrs. Vane. For some reason, that sound didn't make me feel less alone. It just made my nerves twitch. On the second day, Jenny decided to do a deep, brutal clean to finally scrub the smell of someone else's stagnant life out of the rooms. Toward evening, she shut herself in the bathroom, determined to scour the old tub. It sat on rusted claw feet and was completely covered with yellow stains from the harsh local well water. Barely 2 minutes later, she called out to me. Her voice was thick with disgust.
Sam, get in here. Look at this. The water isn't draining at all. It's backed up to the brim.
I walked in. The water in the tub was indeed sitting there, gray, soapy, and completely still. I sighed, tracked down an old wire coat hanger from the closet, ruthlessly straightened it out with a pair of pliers, and bent the tip into a crude hook. I expected to pull up the usual gunk, a clump of lint, soap scum, and dust that always builds up in these rentals. I shoved the wire deep into the dark, foul-smelling drain hole, twisted it around, and hauled it back up. The metal came out hard, catching on something dense. What I dragged into the light made my stomach turn, and Jenny backed all the way into the doorframe, slamming her hand over her mouth. It was a massive, long, slimy rope of black hair. It was unnervingly coarse, more like a horse's mane than human hair, and it was coated in a gray, foul-smelling sludge. The whole clump reeked of swamp rot and wet earth. But the real horror was the detail. Jenny had light, chestnut brown hair, cut into a short bob. This hair was long, midnight black, and there was so much of it. It looked as if someone had spent hours, week after week, combing it down there, or tearing it out of someone's scalp directly over that drain. Fighting down a sudden gag reflex, I jammed the disgusting mess into the plastic trash bin under the sink and scrubbed my hands with dish soap 3 times, but the sensation of that greasy film on my skin wouldn't leave me. That same evening, we realized Barnes was gone. She wasn't under the couch. She wasn't behind the wardrobe. We tore that small 1-bedroom apartment completely apart. We checked every empty drawer in the kitchen, peered into every shadow. Jenny even checked behind the old wooden bathroom vanity. The cat had vanished into thin air. The front door was dead-bolted, and every single old window with its rusty latches was locked tight from the inside. The animal physically could not have left. Jenny sat on the bed, quietly weeping and clutching an empty carrier, while I wandered through the rooms, listening to the old timber of the duplex groan against the wind blowing in from the woods. There was no logical explanation, and that realization left a cold, wet finger tracing down my spine. On the third night, the heavy, suffocating weight of the nightmare moved right into our bed. Jenny fell violently ill. It happened out of nowhere, somewhere around 2 in the morning. I woke up because the old mattress springs beneath us were literally shaking. Jenny was in the grip of a fierce, violent fever. Her skin felt like a radiator. Touching her forehead was like pressing my hand against a hot stove. In just a few hours, her face had become shockingly hollow. The skin stretched tight over her cheekbones, and deep, bruised, purplish-black shadows settled under her eyes, making her look like a corpse. But the most unbearable, the most horrifying part was the smell. When I leaned down to her face, a heavy wave of a sickly sweet, putrid stench hit my nose. It was the exact smell of raw meat left out in the July sun. It felt as though deep inside her, beneath the flesh, the process of rot was already well underway. I bolted out of bed in a panic, reaching for my phone to call emergency services from the county hospital or to run downstairs and bang on Mrs. Vane's door. But Jenny reached out with a sudden, terrifying strength and clamped her hand onto the sleeve of my flannel shirt. Her fingers were ice cold, like frozen meat, and her fingernails had taken on a strange, dirty yellow tint.
Don't. Sam, please don't. No doctors. Don't call anyone. It's just a cold. It's the dampness in this miserable house. It'll be gone by morning. Just stay with me. Please.
Her voice was a ragged, wet wheeze, and her eyes rolled toward the ceiling, as if she were watching something up there that I couldn't see. I stayed. I couldn't bring myself to leave her. I spent the entire night sitting on the edge of the mattress, switching out wet towels on her forehead. The water in the bowl turned warm almost instantly. Jenny thrashed in her delirium, muttering incoherent, broken words that I couldn't piece together. It was only when the sky outside began to turn a faint, bruised gray that she finally went still, dropping into a deep, unnaturally heavy sleep. On the fourth morning, what I thought was a miracle occurred. Looking back, I want to curse my own blind stupidity. Jenny woke up at exactly 8 o'clock. She sat straight up in bed, threw off the blankets, and stood up. The fever was gone without a trace. An unnatural flush burned on her cheeks. Her skin was cool, and her temperature was a perfect 98.6. But it wasn't my Jenny anymore. That internal compass you develop when you live with someone you love was screaming at me. Something is wrong. Run. Her gaze was completely wrong. Our eye contact, which used to be so warm, turned into a form of torture. She would stare straight through me, without blinking, for minutes at a time. Her eyes stayed wide open, cold and empty, like she was examining a piece of furniture or a strange insect. She almost completely stopped speaking to me. To any of my questions, to any casual remark about how she was feeling, she would only give a short, sharp nod or a shake of her head. But the worst part was that she started doing things that used to disgust her. Jenny had always hated cooking, preferring to order a pizza or grab microwave meals from the gas station diner. Now, she stood over the old kitchen stove for hours. She was boiling some kind of dark, foul-smelling herbal sludge in a deep pot, filling the entire apartment with the stench of swamp mud and boiled bone. When I asked her what it was, she didn't answer. Her hand just kept moving the old wooden spoon in a slow, mechanical circle. And she kept humming. It wasn't a song from the radio. It wasn't anything they played on the local stations. It was the same monotonous, creaking, endless drone on a single note. No words, just a low, guttural vibration. It sounded horribly like those ancient Puritan hymns from 300 years ago, the ones religious zealots used to drone out in these woods before they strung up another witch on an elm tree. She would hum it while staring blankly at the empty gray wall of the living room. Hour after hour. Any attempt to hold her or pull her away broke against a stone, icy wall of absolute, terrifying silence. On the fifth night, the thin thread holding my sanity together finally snapped. I woke up in the dead of night to a strange, rhythmic sound coming from the entryway. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was dull, heavy, muffled by the old wallpaper. My wristwatch on the nightstand read exactly 3:15. The room was filled with the suffocating, icy frost. The old wall heater had shut down. I turned my head, and my blood ran cold. Jenny wasn't there. Her side of the bed was neatly made and already freezing to the touch. I got out of bed, carefully avoiding the creaking boards, and slipped out into the hallway. The narrow corridor was flooded with a sickly blue moonlight spilling from the kitchen window. Jenny was standing there. She wore nothing but a thin white nightgown that looked gray in the half-light. She stood at the very end of the hall, facing our front door. I realized she was sleepwalking, but the way she was doing it made the hair on my arms stand up. Her body was unnervingly rigid, her arms pinned straight down her sides like wooden stakes. She would take one slow, mechanical step forward, and then, with the full momentum of her weight, she would throw her forehead against the heavy oak wood of the door. Thud. Then she would freeze for a second, take a step back, and throw her body forward again. Thud. There was already a dark, wet smudge spreading on the pale wood of the frame. A wild primal terror clamped down on my lungs. Jenny. My voice cracked into a dry whisper. Jenny, for God's sake, stop. What are you doing? Go back to bed, Jenny. She stopped instantly, and in the very next second, I heard a sound that will haunt my nightmares until the day I die. Slowly, with an unmistakable, dry, splintering crack, her neck began to turn toward me. Her shoulders and her torso remained completely motionless, Only her head turned. The joints popped so loudly, it sounded like someone snapping dry kindling in a vaulted cellar. She looked at me. In the moonlight, her face was a dead, bruised gray, mottled with dark patches. Her eyes, Christ, her eyes were just massive black craters. Every single capillary in her sclera had ruptured, drowning the whites in a thick, dark pool of blood, completely erasing her pupils into the blackness. Her lips peeled back into a wide, rubbery, dead smile, exposing her bloody gums.
It's so tight. Sammy, let us out.
The voice belonged to her, but it came from somewhere deep in her gut, dragged up with a horrible, whistling, guttural rasp. It felt as though something incredibly heavy, ancient, and starving was trying to speak through her vocal cords, tearing them apart in the process. She took a sharp, sudden step toward me. As she did, her knee joints locked and snapped backward with a sickening pop, like the hind leg of a goat. I don't remember how my reflexes took over. I let out a wild shriek, slammed the bedroom door shut, turned the flimsy key in the lock, and threw my back against the heavy wooden dresser, shoving it frantically against the frame. For the rest of the night, until the sun finally broke, all I heard from the other side of the door was a low, monotonous, maddening scratching of fingernails against the linoleum, like something trying to burrow its way under the wood. On the sixth night, hell opened up completely, leaving us no way out. I hadn't left the bedroom all day. I sat on the floor, my back pressed against our barricade, terrified of making a single sound. Jenny was moving around the apartment, but her steps had changed. They were heavy, dragging, shuffling, like the gait of a decrepit old man or a cripple. Around 2 a.m, the steps approached the kitchen. I heard a sharp, metallic screech. She pulled out the heavy drawer and took the large meat cleaver. Then the footsteps came straight from my door. Without a single word, she began to hack methodically into the thin wood. The blade bit into the paneling with a sickening crunch, sending splinters flying through the cracks. From the other side came her insane, wet, rattling laughter, which kept spiking into an ultra-high, ear-piercing shriek. She was trying to hack through to the lock. My fingers wouldn't work. Sweat was stinging my eyes. I misdialed 3 times on the screen of my old smartphone before I finally heard the distant, tired voice of the County 911 dispatcher. County 4, urgent, Mill Road, House 12, the duplex at the end. My girlfriend, she's completely snapped. She's got a huge knife. She's breaking down the door. She's trying to kill me. Please, send someone, faster. 10 minutes later, minutes that felt like centuries spent in purgatory, a heavy Ford Sheriff's Cruiser tore into the yard, engine roaring. Through the bedroom window, I saw the red and blue strobes explode across the trunks of the pines, slicing through the thick Vermont fog. 2 deputies scrambled out of the truck, an old weathered cop named Miller and a very young kid named Carter. I'd seen them a few times at the gas station diner. Miller was holding a heavy Remington 870 pump-action 12-gauge shotgun. They took the outdoor wooden stairs 3 at a time. Our front door was unlocked.
County Sheriff, nobody move. Drop the weapon. Step into the hall with your hands up.
I curled into a ball behind the dresser, holding my breath. And then happened the thing that permanently broke my mind. The entity inside Jenny didn't retreat. It lunged straight out of the kitchen's darkness with a terrifying, impossible, animal speed. A brutal, messy slaughter started in that narrow hallway. It wasn't like a movie. It happened with a sickening, chaotic swiftness. I heard young Carter let out a wild, high-pitched scream of pure, unadulterated terror. Then, a dull, heavy thud, the horrific sound of cervical vertebrae snapping, and the distinct, pressurized spray of blood hitting the drywall. The thing had torn his throat out with its bare hands.
Holy shit! Carter, no, die, you bitch, die!
The 12-gauge roared, deafeningly loud. For a fraction of a second, the muzzle flash lit up the gap under my door. The buckshot ripped clean through the thin partition wall of the bedroom, raining plaster and splinters down on my head. But the thing didn't even slow down. Jenny's unnatural, triumphant, screeching laughter rang out, followed immediately by the wet collapse of Miller's chest cavity. The old deputy let out a heavy, bubbling wheeze, drowning in his own blood. I listened to his heavy body being dragged across the linoleum of the entryway, painting the floor. I jammed my hands over my ears, squeezed my eyes shut, and began to howl quietly, wedged into the tight space between the mattress and the wall. And then, everything went dead silent. For the remaining 3 hours until dawn, I sat in a semi-conscious state, listening to only one sound. Out there, in the blood-soaked hallway, someone was loudly, greedily eating in the dark, smacking their lips, taking their time, snapping large human bones with their teeth. In the morning, the State Police Tactical Unit blew out the bedroom windows and swarmed the place. They carried me out, wrapped in a gray wool blanket. I tried my absolute best to look only at the ceiling, but as they led me through the entryway, I saw what was left of Carter. His head was resting separately in the corner, facing the baseboard, and his torn, empty abdomen had spilled its bluish coils across the floor. Miller lay a little further down. His rib cage was completely crushed flat, as if a loaded logging truck had rolled over it multiple times. Jenny was gone. They didn't find her in the surrounding woods, or in Caspian Lake, or up at the border. She had simply dissolved into the morning fog. A week later, while I was being endlessly questioned at the sheriff's department, one of the detectives took pity on my shaking hands and showed me the sealed forensics report from the house. The state police had run a full sweep after they pried up the old cast iron tub and tore into the floorboards. The previous tenant was a guy named Thomas Cleve, a former slaughterer from the local regional abattoir. He was a reclusive, bitter loner who had gone completely off the deep end into a filthy, underground brand of occultism. He had turned that isolated apartment into a literal breeding ground for something dark. For months, he had been bringing animal entrails home from the slaughterhouse, performing ritual sacrifices, trying to call up some ancient, starving parasite that had lived in these Vermont woods for centuries. He ended up slitting his wrists right inside that tub. And under the tub, hidden behind a tightly nailed wooden false panel that the forensics team had to crowbar away, they found a massive pentagram carved deep into the floorboards. The symbol was caked in layers of blackened, dried sacrificial blood. And right there, among the ritual ash and burnt tallow candles, lay the remains of a shredded cat hide, a 3-colored calico hide. Barnes hadn't run away on the second day. The thing Cleve had called up, the thing trapped within those walls, had dragged our cat under the tub on our very first night, using her blood to feed itself and finish its messy, uncompleted ritual. And Jenny was just the next, larger vessel. I left Vermont that same afternoon, for good. Now I live out of cheap roadside motels. I barely sleep at night. And I never, do you hear me? Never sign a lease without digging into the history of the house first. Because behind a cheap price and a landlord's smile, there might be something already sitting in the dark, patiently waiting for you to share its next meal.